Alrighty, everyone. As I was saying, thank you for joining us today. So the purpose of this meeting is to have a listening session with various different stakeholders because we are going to be drafting our next version of the animal feeding operations general discharge permit. And we wanted to make sure that we're receiving input from folks on how the program essentially is currently going, and then before we actually start to make updates and start drafting the next version of the permit. So I should say that before we get started, this is a listening session. We aren't necessarily going to be talking about potential future provisions of the 25 AF animal feeding operations permit. Again, we really want to make sure that we are receiving input before we actually start the major drafting for that. With that being said, there will be another opportunity during the actual public participation process for folks to give feedback on the actual proposed permit conditions. And if there's a public hearing that's requested, then we would go through that process, and we would respond to each one of those comments as well. And then make any adjustments to the permit as necessary. So without further ado, I'll first open it up to questions to see if folks have any questions on that format, and then we can get right in to this presentation, which is a brief overview of the permitting program, and then we'll actually get into walking through the different sections of the permit and getting input on those for the next permit cycle. Any questions on that? All right. So why is there a permit? So the U.S. EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has delegated their authority for us to implement essentially the Clean Water Act program, and that a part of that does include the animal feeding operations. So on behalf of the EPA, we actually implement that federal program. So what are the benefits of having that permit? I feel like it protects public health and the environment, clean air, clean water, clean land, clean water, clean air. We think that there are benefits that would include reducing runoff, erosion, which then has benefits to improve water quality. Depending on what land management practices a farmer may be implementing, especially for the land plan, you could see improved soil health. And if you can retain more nutrients on site, then there would be less need for spending money on fertilizers. And then if you have improved soil health, more carbon in the soil, more bacteria, that can also help increase yields as well. So there could be other benefits than just the environmental benefits that we are talking about. Also, another important aspect of the permit is to ensure that there is a fair playing field across the various different animal feeding operations, and to provide clarity to farmers so that they know what they need to do in order to comply with Maryland law. All right. So this is the last of our 4 listening sessions. So our first session was at UMEF near Princess Anne. Then we were in Easton at the community center. Then we were at Frederick at the county government um, location, and then our last one, which is today, is the virtual location. So since our servers are in uh, Maryland or in our building right here, I just want to thank everyone for joining us in Baltimore right now. All right. So I talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the session. The purpose of this listening session is to receive input from stakeholders before we actually get into the major drafting of this permit. Um, we feel like it's important to get input from a variety of stakeholders to make sure that we are, first of all, listening and then taking into consideration what those questions, concerns, clarifications, or other items might be when we actually go to draft the permit. Now, I should note that there are some things that we cannot change in the permit. Um, there are some things that are required by in federal law that we, at a minimum, have to implement in the permit. There are also items in statute and in regulation that we can't change with permit language because, again, those are set forth in statute or regulation, and that would either need legislation to change those items or to go through a rule making effort, but we would not be able to make those changes in uh, the, the, the permitting process. So again, there will be another opportunity for stakeholders to comment on the actual permit provisions. And we are expecting that to be hopefully early next year. And then, so yeah. Any questions on the goal of the listening session? All right, moving on. So what does this delay in comment from the public do to the timeline? Is there somewhere to submit written comments? So there's a couple. So the first one, uh, through the public participation process, there's a process that's actually established in law where um, where folks can submit their comments, and when we get to that point, we will actually make sure that that is communicated in all of our press releases and messaging on like how exactly to do that. Again, this is before we get to the finishing the draft of the permit to make sure that we're receiving input as opposed to feedback on the actual permitting um, uh, permit conditions, or I should say draft permit conditions, because they're drafts at that point. Um, and and then so if you want to send me comments as well, I'm going to have my email at the end of this presentation, and then and so it doesn't, and the next question here about compressing the time for public input, there is a set amount of time in law where the public can give their input. So that's the same for whatever we are doing. So that wouldn't necessarily compress, or that wouldn't compress that time frame. Again, this is before we get to finishing the draft of the permit. We want to make sure that we are hearing from the various different stakeholders and taken into consideration what those questions, comments, clarifications, concerns are. All right. Any questions, further questions on that? Okay. So our permit is was effective July 8th, 2020. This is what's known as a general permit as opposed to an individual permit. Um, Animal feeding operations apply to be registered under the conditions of the general permit, where and those provisions are the same for every single animal feeding operation that is out there. Uh, Whereas for an individual permit, there may be some very site-specific provisions depending on what's going on at your site, essentially. So our listening sessions are from September to October, and then so we are hoping to drop the draft permit in early 2025. So the public comment period would also end in early 2025. And then hopefully we would issue our new permit before this current one expires by July 7th, 2025. So that's the time frame that we are working with right now. Any questions on this? All right. So now, since we might have some folks on here that aren't uh, working with this every day, we're going to just briefly go over what this permit covers, what types of operations are actually required to be covered under here, um, and but it can be at a pretty high level. So an AFO, or an animal feeding operation, is a lot or facility, and I've kind of bolded the the key parts of this definition, where the following conditions are met. So they have to be stabled or confined, these animals, and fed or maintained for a total of 45 days or more in any 12-month period. So stabled or confined, that one's pretty self-explanatory, where you're feeding the animals also, or maintained. Maintained, um, according to the EPA, means you are housing the animals where manure is collected as well. And then the 45 days is this isn't a straight 45 days. It can be it doesn't have to be consecutive. So it can be 10 days here, 5 days here, 3 days here, another 20 days here, where you have animals confined. It doesn't have to be the same animals that are confined um, in any given year as well. Uh, it's So those are probably the two big ones. And another, so what exactly does a day mean? So if you confine an animal for any time of that day, that is considered to be one day. So a good example of this is, let's say you have a dairy operation, and that dairy operation has what's known as a pasture. Um, but if you bring those animals in to milk, then that is, unless you're doing the milking right on the pasture, that would be considered confinement, and that would count as one day. And this is actually the example that the EPA uses when they uh, explain what one day of confinement means. They actually point to the dairy operations. So we had one of our listenings and sessions in Frederick. We're definitely doing a lot more messaging out. in that part of the state, just making it clear that if you bring an animal in for milking, that does count as 1 day. Now, that doesn't, just because a particular operation is defined as an animal feeding operation, we regulate concentrated animal feeding operations and Maryland animal feeding operations. And uh, so this doesn't necessarily mean that you're required to get a permit. And then any 12-month period, that what that means is any rolling 12-month period, it's not confined to just the calendar year. That's how you have to do your counting, essentially. And then the second part of this definition um, gets at whether or not you are um, a, on a lot or a pasture, and whether animals can sustain themselves with the vegetation that is growing on that particular part of the facility. Any questions on the animal feeding operation definition? All right. Well, so the concentrated animal feeding definition, or the CAFO definition, is a medium AFO or a large AFO. We will get into what exactly that means. It's based off of size categories, which are um, in COMAR, which are the regulations, where the regulations of the state are housed. And then those actually come from the Code of Federal Regulations, which are uh, and those are EPA regulations. That discharges or proposes to discharge. I should note that in the state of Maryland, we have a more stringent definition of discharge, where the EPA is more looking at actual discharges. Uh, our definition of discharge includes potential discharges, or uh, putting a pollutant in a area where it's likely to pollute. So our definition of a discharge is a little bit broader than what the federal definition. And then finishing this up to surface waters of this state. So we do actually have the ability to permit small animal feeding operations. There are some caveats to that, though. It's not an automatic thing, whereas with medium animal feeding operations and large animal feeding operations uh, need to get permitted in the state if they want to operate. Essentially, the criteria for us is, we first of all, we have to do an inspection, and then we have to document that animals or manure are coming in contact with surface water. So we essentially have to show that there's a discharge happening at that site. So we've never done this before. We've had a couple sites where we were considering it this past year, but we do actually have the ability um, to permit small animal feeding operations. And then the last item on here is the regional administrator, which is the Environmental Protection Agency. They have the ability to designate animal feeding operations as concentrated animal feeding operations. And they are actually currently doing this in uh, one of the states just north of us. So uh, that's something that they're working on with that particular state. Any questions on the definition of a concentrated animal feeding operation? All right. So MAFO, or a Maryland animal feeding operation. So this is a AFO that is not a CAFO. So if we go back to, and the key part is the discharges to surface waters right here. So a large AFO, according to the table. So if you're, and we'll actually get to what those numbers are. But essentially, if you're only discharging to groundwaters and not to surface waters, um, you have the potential to be um, a permitted Maryland animal feeding operation. So we permit all large MAFOs according to the table, which we will get to. And then we have the ability to permit medium per the citation in Comar right here. But when you actually go to this citation right here, it mentions small and medium animal feeding operations. So we actually have the ability to permit small and medium Maryland animal feeding operations. Any questions on this? Okay, so this is just a portion of the table that I was talking about before. Um, these are the most common animal types that are permitted in Maryland. The big one is chickens, laying or other than laying hens, right here with dry manure handling. We have a number of dairy operations. I think we have one or two cattle. We have two or three, maybe duck operations. One of those is going to be coming online. And then we have a few laying operations as well. So I should point out that this cattle definition right here includes bulls, steers, heifers, and cow-calf pairs. And this dairy cattle um, includes milked and dry dairy cattle. So if you have a dry dairy cattle, it would not be counted as cattle; it would be counted as dairy cattle in this situation. And that is important because what gets you in the door to be permitted if you are an animal feeding operation, if you meet the size requirements for, let's say, dairy right here, 200, then you would need to be permitted in the state of Maryland. Any questions on this? All right. So bringing it all together, I'm a very visual person. So this is a two-part test. So the first thing that you do is you determine whether you're an animal feeding operation, which is essentially stable confining animals and feeding or maintaining them for 45 days. And we talked about the nuances with 45 days. So if you're discharging surface water, again, we have a broader definition of discharge than the feds. Then we would need to permit large and medium that meet that, and then we have the ability to permit a small, but we have to do an inspection and we have to essentially show that there or document that there is a discharge that is occurring at that site. Now, if you're discharging to only groundwater, then we permit all of the larges, and then uh, we have the ability to permit a smaller or medium, but again, we have to show um, after an inspection that a discharge is occurring. Any questions on this? I should note that this is for CAFOs. There is this is different than um, the federal regulations. They permit all large concentrated animal feeding operations, and then there's a potential um, to permit medium, but there's certain criteria. If you're reading that EPA regulations, those certain criteria at a federal level don't apply because in the state of Maryland, we have a broader definition for what a concentrated animal feeding operation is. All right. So this is my email right here. This is actually my office phone. I didn't put my work cell phone because my office is pretty much encased in concrete. So I don't have very good cell service. So if you want to give me a call, the 410 number is the best way to get a hold of me. Also, if you have comments or you want to set up a meeting to discuss um, anything that has to do with animal feeding operations, we would be happy to set up that meeting as well. I would also encourage you to subscribe to all of our social media. There's a lot of really important information for stakeholders that we post on all of those media. Um, we are planning on definitely doing more listening sessions in the future as a way to get information. First of all, get information out to stakeholders and also to hear from the stakeholders on particular issues that are relevant for that particular community. So definitely subscribe to our social media if you have not done so as well. And you might also learn some other interesting things about the state of Maryland as well if you do that too. Okay. Before we get into the listening session part of this, because it's been a lot of me talking at you, all who have joined us. Are there any questions before we move on? Okay, hearing none. All right. So we did have a presentation with the different sections, but we found out that we actually needed to get into some of the detail of the permit when we were walking or when we were receiving input for the next permit cycle. So going to be walking through the different sections of the permit, asking for feedback. Now you can either raise your hand. So next to the three dots at the bottom to the left of that, there should be a hand. Um, or you can just speak up. That's fine as well. Or you can put a question in the chat. I do have two screens, so I should be able to see if people are putting questions in the chat as well. We will try to make sure that we get to all of those. Now, if you are going to be providing comments, input, if you can identify yourself, or if you if you can identify yourself and what organization you are with, um, that would be helpful as well. And again, we would encourage you to use the hand. So that's me raising my hand right there. And then if multiple people have their hands raised, there will be a queue, and then we'll walk through each one of those, uh, each one of those folks in order. And we don't have too many folks on this call right here. So we were going to have like a 2-minute cap, but we aren't necessarily, I don't think we're going to be have time constraints. But we would just ask that folks be prompt as well. Okay. So our permit is set up in, I believe it's either 7 or 8 parts. So the first part has to do with applicability and authorized discharges. The second part has to do with definitions, which is my favorite part of the permit. Part 3 are application requirements. So if you're going to be submitting an application to the state of Maryland for coverage under this permit so that you can operate your concentrated animal feeding operation. These are the things that you have to provide with that. Then we have a section for special conditions. which this is where the meat and potatoes, as they say, are for this particular permit. And then part 5 is monitoring and reporting. Part 6, we are not going to be going over in this particular listening session. This is where there's definitions of like civil criminal liability, what the potential penalties could be for various different types of issues. So we won't be going over those. We do have part 7, which are general conditions. So I should note that a lot of these are tied to EPA requirements. So we have less wiggle room on what we can do with this part. So we won't be going over part 7 right here. And then part 8 is our authority. So any questions, comments, concerns before we start to get into the different parts of the permit? All right. Cool. So, so part 1 talks about when the permit is required. I already talked a lot about this in the first part of the presentation, so I'm actually going to skip over some of these items. And when I was asking for questions in that first part, we didn't really get anything. So I'm going to move through this part a little bit more quickly if folks don't mind. But if you see something that catches your eye, then definitely put your hand up. All right, just checking to see. Cool. So we talked already about medium AFOs and CAFOs, small CAFOs. This is the reference after a site inspection. If animals or animal waste are coming in contact with surface water, we can designate a small animal feeding operation as a CAFO, which would need to be permitted. We talked about the list already. Talked about MAFOs. This is the complete chart. Animal feeding operation, animal types by size table. And again, this is largely coming from the EPA. So there's not a lot that we can do with the different size requirements. I should note that we do have the ability to permit animal feeding operations that are outside of the state of Maryland, as long as the majority of their production area and land application area are located in the state of Maryland. We actually have one of these situations, and that is, I'm not going to name the name, but it's in northern Maryland, and most of their operation is actually in the state of Maryland. So we actually do permit that. And I should note that if you're using a spray irrigation system, you need to obtain permit coverage either under an individual permit or a general permit. Any questions on those two items? Those don't come up as much, but sometimes do. Yeah, Spartan.
Hi, this is Bart Rubenstein. I'm a Trapp, Maryland resident. Been living there since the 1970s with my family, and I'm a little bit of a newbie to this process which you are presenting today. But I have been experiencing the Eastern Shore for many years, and have seen the degradation of the Choptank River, and have seen how different it is from, let's say, the Miles River, where there's less agriculture and less chicken farming. And I was just wondering, you might have already covered this, but I mean, I see all the things that you're trying to do to to get chicken farmers to adhere to the way they manage their properties, but it seems appropriate that they should also be a part of the wider footprint of participating in keeping the rivers clean. So, even with all their efforts to minimize the runoff, they should be either participating directly to keeping the rivers cleaner, or they should be, adding money to a fund that will assist other people to do that. So forgive me if I'm asking the questions that's already been addressed, but this is just something that I'm, representing my whole family. We have a lot of family members that are concerned about this. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's a good question. So just to talk a little bit about Clean Water Act 101, and if you want a more detailed and more nuanced conversation on the Clean Water Act, I would point you to our water administration, our water and science administration. But essentially, if water bodies are what's called impaired, so they're above certain surface water quality levels, then what's called a TMDL, and I always refer to TMDL, but I forget what it stands for sometimes. Total maximum daily load has to be developed for that particular water body that is impaired. So we actually have a pretty interesting map on our website where you can look at all of the impaired water bodies that are in the state of Maryland. And then once a water body becomes impaired, then you have to develop this TMDL, which would try to identify different sources of pollution, the loading that is coming from those different sources, and then it also requires a plan of action, essentially, to bring that water back into compliance with the Clean Water Act. So we have what's called a watershed improvement plan. Sometimes, and there's WIP goals in there. So watershed improvement plan, WIP goals. So those are various different practices that have to be implemented that would reduce the pollution in the state of Maryland. So Maryland, compared to our sister states, is actually doing relatively well on our WIP goals. I believe there's a report. It's either MDA or our water group that issues that. I'm not necessarily in that part of the program. And there's frequent updates on the progress of achieving those WIP goals as well. There's also various different cost share programs, especially on the agriculture side. So the federal government has a pot of money that can where you can apply for that. So it is a cost share program where the farmer does have to put up some money, and my understanding is done on a reimbursement basis as well. And then NDA also has a pot of money for to implement those controls that would reduce potential pollution into those different waterways. There's other various groups. I think the Chesapeake Bay Foundation gives grants as well. And so the good news is there's a lot of money and resources that are out there to put these controls in. My friends at NBA, Byron, Keith, now Darren, Dave Mister, their teams are actually very busy trying to make sure that we get those projects in so that we can meet those WIP goals. And if you look at loading, there are improvements in loading over time. I hope that answers your question, but there's a lot that's definitely going around this subject.
Well, if I could just follow up, I mean, it sounds like there is a lot, and I'm greatly appreciative. I know there's an organization called Shore Rivers that are, they have river keepers that are focused on it. But I mean, the bottom line still is that, the water quality of, for instance, the Choptank River is significantly different than it was 50 years ago, when you could literally look down on your dock pier piling and see fairly clear water and no algae on the and you'd see a fair amount of barnacles. Now it's just gunk on it, and there's you could pull crabs off the pilings at will, which hasn't been the case for many decades now. So I respect all these things in place, but is there anything? Is it just because, I mean, it's not like as if the agriculture is still the same as it was 50 years ago. I mean, it's still the number of people farming and the amount of acreage is the same, but something has changed significantly.
So something in the state of Maryland, we actually have one of the most advanced, if not the most advanced, nutrient management program in the entire state of Maryland. If Dwight or someone wants to talk about it, they certainly can. I thought Dwight jump on. But what we require our farmers to do are of much higher quality and more rigorous than than surrounding states as well. And when you look at the loading data, like by county, for example, you can see it. It's pretty stark. So we do have one of the best nutrient management programs in the entire nation, and we are. It's slow progress. We are making progress, but we're not there yet. Definitely.
Okay. Can you share the link of that, those maps on the chat? So I can just see that link, because I don't know where to find to see that information. Because I do know that Maryland is, one of the top 3 environmentally focused states in the country. So that's very pleasing to know, but still, and it's also, I know that we still have a ways to go. So obviously we just all have to be patient.
Yeah. So some of the maps that I look at are, there's the CAST tool, which stands for, sorry for your inconvenience, but we're performing some maintenance at the moment. So these maps aren't available right now. But you can just you can Google CAST, CAFP, Chesapeake Bay, and that should get you a lot of really good information. There's also the universities have a lot of really good information as well in terms of modeling. There's some good maps on the Chesapeake Bay Foundation as well, and our own website. So we can, if you did you get my email? We can send that to you as well.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
We'll make sure my email is on is repopulated so that we can make sure that we're getting stuff out to folks. All right. Good question. I do see from Gabby. So I saw a question from Diana and then Gabby. So again, we're just asking folks to identify who they're with. So first, I think I may have already answered Diana's question, but who are you, or what organization are you with, Diana, or are you just are you here from the public? So we'll move on to Gabby. Gabby, which organization are you with, and or are you from the public?
I represent a small community-led activist group called Concerned Citizens Against Industrial CAFOs, or CCIC.
Yeah, yeah. So to answer your question, discussion or awareness of CAFOs discharging into MD waterways. There was actually a pretty big case that settled with the EPA, where we're working with one of our sister states to improve the practices that are happening in that particular state. Um, and we're also in uh, communication with the other states in Region 3 as well. So there's information sharing that goes along with that. But there was some recent litigation that settled. All right. Okay, so this next part of the permit, it goes over authorized discharges. So again, I'm not going to read everything and bore you all to tears. But if you do have comments and questions on these particular parts of the permit, um, clarification that may need to happen, um, we could certainly go over this. So. So this talks about existing CAFOs, new CAFOs, new source CAFOs. So if you're going to be building new houses, Maryland animal feeding operation. Oh, so they turned the lights off on me at around 6 o'clock in an effort to save some energy. So unless if someone turns on the light, I'm probably going to be in the dark for a little bit. So, but the important part is what I'm sharing on the screen. All right. So we have, this permit does not authorize discharges of pollutants, including manure, litter, and processed wastewater. This would be uh, compared to like a wastewater treatment plant, which is allowed to discharge, but they have to make sure that those concentrations of those particular pollutants are below certain levels before they can actually do that. So that's a pretty important part of our permit. All right. And again, if you have a question, just raise your hand or put something in the chat and I'll try and get to you. We already talked about the definition of animal feeding operation. There is this, I didn't have this in my presentation, but 2 or more AFOs under common ownership, so if they are commonly owned, are considered a single animal feeding operation. And this is really just for the purposes of counting animals if they adjoin each other, so if they're next to each other. So you can have CAFO 1 and CAFO 2 on 2 different parcels, but if they're commonly owned by the same person or organization or partnership or whatever situation that you have, then you need to count that as one operation. And then, or if you have a common area or system for the disposal of waste. So we just ran into this actually, where we had 2 operations that are maybe a quarter mile, half mile away from each other, and they were sharing the same um, manure storage. So we told them that they had to be one operation. So um, that's an example of where the second one would come into consideration, or system for the area or system for the disposal of waste. And in this situation, those 2 animal feeding operations don't have to be adjoining. They can be separated, but if they have a common area system for the disposal of waste, we would have to count them as one operation. All right. So looking at animal waste, one thing I want to point out here is other animal operations. So this would include imported manure or imported manure from another animal operation or from a manure broker. So if you're doing that, then that gets looped in to our permit as well. Approved alternatives, COMAR, Code of Maryland regulations, comprehensive nutrient management plan. We already talked about the what a CAFO is, concentrated animal feeding operation. Critical areas, which we have to point to our friends at the Department of Natural Resources for what those are. The department here is in the Maryland Department of the Environment, although we do reference other departments throughout this permit and requirements of those departments. This is what I was talking about, the definition of discharge. So A was first part are actual discharges. The second part, placing the pollutant in a location where the pollutant is likely to pollute. That would still count as a discharge. So we can regulate potential discharge where there is a risk. And we do have, we anticipated in this particular session having some folks that don't work with this every day. So there are going to be some parts where I'm going to go down a little bit deeper and like what exactly this means. Field ditch. Frozen ground. Not going to read through all these. Again, if you have a question on the definition, some of them I will actually stop at. So the land application area. So in these permits, we have the production area. And we'll get to the definition of the production area, but the production area is essentially where the animals are and where manure is being stored. Among a whole other list of items. Land application area is where manure is being applied as a nutrient source. So the important part of this definition is it applies to either the owner or the operator, whether that land is owned, rented, or leased. So pretty broad, to which the pollutants, potential pollutants that we regulate are from the production area is or may be applied right here. Any questions on the land application area? All right, moving on. We already talked about a MAFO, NRCS. We have new source performance standards, which reference this part of our permit, and we'll get to that on what exactly those are. So I will stop at organic poultry pasture. I know our friends at NDA, their plan writers are working on the organic poultry pasture plans right now. We recently issued some guidance earlier this year on, on specific criteria for organic poultry pasture. And that is currently on our website. And then that criteria would be included in the plans that we received from the different animal feeding operations. All right. Poultry pasture, which is related to the organic operation. Um, this is processed wastewater. Um, one of the things that we like to highlight, and this is probably more with, I would say, the dairy operations byproducts right here, including byproducts from feed. So the leachate that potentially comes from feed as well, that would need to be managed appropriately. This is the definition of the production area right here. Required plans, setbacks, we have soil conservation and water quality plans. Oftentimes you'll hear these referred to as conservation plans for short. All right. Okay. So waters of the state, in the state of Maryland, we do have a broader definition of waters of the US. And the major part of that is we also regulate discharges to underground waters or groundwater. And then there's a whole slew of things of what that could be right here. So there's some court cases, I don't know if they've been resolved or not, that talk about hydraulic connectivity with groundwater, or what's a ditch, what's adjacent, what's immediately adjacent. Uh, those don't necessarily apply in the state of Maryland, and my attorneys can correct me, since I know some of them are on here. But because we have a broader definition in the state of Maryland, those nuances would get looped into our definition of waters of the state, and then would be regulated as well. All right. Any questions on that? Cool. Um, Now we're talking about the notice of intent. Changes in ownership or operator terminates the registration. Um, so, uh, so any operation that does not follow the transfer provision in our permit, uh, if you don't follow that and the terms that are in that section, then your registration would be terminated. Any questions on that? All right. Now we have the content in the NOI. Some of these are requirements. So CFRs, whenever you see that It's going to stand for the Code of Federal Regulation. A lot of these are in reference to that. So this would have to be part of the application, which we provide a form for that is submitted to the state of Maryland. Any questions on these items? Yes, Gabby.
Hi. Question, are applicants required to submit an EJ environmental justice screening, or is that done by MDE?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So applicants, as a part of their application, do have to supply an EJ score. We have a tool for that is on our website. And we are using the final percentile, which includes, because there's many different scores depending on how you do the filters, but we are using the final percentile for that particular. And then when we go to public notice, so we have a website where all of that information is posted. You can download the plan and the plans and the application, and it would have that EJ score on there.
Okay.
Now there are some nuances with that, depending, because the law happened kind of in the middle of the permitting section, so that is kind of our start date for that. But
Okay.
in general, like those are on those
Does
on the public notices that we send out, and we
Okay.
verify those as well.
Okay, I was just about to ask that. Thank you.
Yeah. So, but our friends at MDA and the plan writers, they help the farmers fill those out. So we aren't really seeing any issues with that. And same with the TSPs, the technical service providers, so the consultants will help farmers do that. And we're not really seeing issues with like a wrong number or something like that. And if it is wrong, it's a pretty easy fix.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. All right. Required signatures. So if you're going to apply, you do have to certify that everything is true to the best of your knowledge, information, and beliefs, under penalty of perjury. So that's pretty standard for all of the permits that we have, having something like that in there. These are the signatories. So sometimes we'll have like a corporation that applies, or a sole proprietor, or a partnership. So this just gives some guidance on what exactly, like who needs to sign for that. You need to be an authorized person, essentially. But that differs depending on what type of legal entity, or what type of legal entity is actually applying. I don't know if we've had a municipal, state, or federal apply, so that'd be interesting. This may be language from like our wastewater treatment plant permits as well. So consistency in naming, so the NOI again is the application and required plans. Sometimes it's like the father that signs the NOI and it's the son that signs the plan. So we just need to make sure that everything is consistent. Like we're dealing with the actual authorized person in this particular case. Okay. All right, now we're going to talk about required plans submitted to the department. So oftentimes we will get an application, but it'll take some time to develop the plan, especially if new features are going in, new controls are being added. It can take there may be some delay time between the NOI and the plans that actually come into the state. And the plans are very detailed. And again, we post all of our plans on our webpage when they go up to public notice. And that would have the application, the nutrient management plan, the comprehensive nutrient management plan, and the conservation plan, typically for those. Talking about the conservation plan. This last iteration of the permit, we added information on like watersheds, impairments, tier 2 watershed. So that's new information that we are receiving as a part of the application. Okay. Alrighty, now we are working through the registration process. Okay. So important part of the application is paying application or applicable fees. Because we have to make sure that we are using that money for our staff time to review those plans and our inspectors to go out to make sure that um, animal feeding operations are following what's actually said in those plans. All right. Now we're going to be getting into the special conditions part of the permit. Any questions before I move on? And I should say at the end of this, we're gonna open it up. If folks have comments in general, maybe you didn't see exactly what you wanted to see in this particular permit, but we're using this as a foundation because uh, a lot of stuff is going to say largely the same in the next permit cycle. So we want to make sure that we're getting input on what's going on, and then there could be additions after that. But all of that could change as a part of the public participation process, which is important, and that's why we actually go through that process. All right. So there needs to be an assessment of what's called resource concerns. And then if you identify a resource concern, then you need to make sure you're implementing practices to address that particular resource concern. So we actually have a checklist that the plan writers use to aid them on what particular resource concerns might be. And that is also posted as a part of the public notice. So you can see what, if any, if there were resource concerns that were associated with that particular operation. So these resource concerns identified, these are the ones that must be addressed right here. So, but there's a whole list of other resource concerns as well. So storage of animal manure and litter, heavy use areas. So these might be where there's a lot of vehicle traffic, animals, stuff like that. Diversion of stormwater, vegetation, mortality management, and all of these have to be NRCS practice standards. A lot of folks call them BMPs or best management practices, but NRCS would prefer that you call them practice standards. All right, moving on. All right. Then we have special conditions with liquid manure management. So it's just the fact that it's a liquid, it tends to move a little bit more. So we have more requirements for that. Application on frozen ground. So I don't know if we have any dairies online or if we because this can sometimes apply for that. So field app, this is an important part. Field application of animal waste shall not take place on frozen ground or snow cover ground without written permission from the department. And again, gone up to the definitions, whenever you see the word department, that's the Maryland Department of Environment. So MDA also has some joint authority in here. So if, let's say, there's going to be a catastrophic release from a particular manure system, there are provisions to allow for that. It is pretty rare. But if that particular manure liquid process, or it would be liquid manure in this case, is going to be applied on frozen ground and snow cover ground, not only do you need to reach out to MDA, which is in their nutrient management regulations, you also need written permission from the Maryland Department of Environment as well. Any questions on that? We are planning on doing a dairy day with our friends at MDA. So keep your eyes out for that, where we are going to be walking through some of these considerations, especially as it applies to application of frozen ground, for what does the 45 days mean? Am I an animal feeding operation? So we're going to be doing a lot more of that, definitely. And so, yeah. And then for this application of frozen ground or snow covered ground, you'll see that if you don't have enough storage, you'll see later in the permit that one of the 9 minimum standards is adequate storage. So if you don't have enough storage, we're going to be wanting to do an assessment to see if there is adequate manure storage at that particular site. So it'd be important to set up an inspection, and we have done inspections in the past when this has occurred, to ensure that that manure is being managed appropriately on site. All right, self-inspections. So the next part is self-inspections. We have 2 table that have to do with self-inspection. The first is with land operations. It has what type of inspection it is, how often you need to do that inspection, and whether it's applicable to liquid or dry manure or both. Because depending on whether you're handling liquid manure or dry manure, again, liquid's going to move around a little bit more on you. So there's going to be more considerations for that. And so then we have the no land table, which isn't going to have the stuff that's associated with the land application area. All right. Any questions on the different types of self-inspection that operations need to be doing? First one is on transfers of manure, application of these different animal wastes. Mortalities, animal waste storage areas, manure samples, and soil samples, I should say, as well. Manure application equipment, inspections on stormwater routing structures. I do want to stop on this water line as well. So this is a daily inspection. And this inspection still needs to happen even if birds are not on site and the water is turned off. So the reason being is, one, there can still be leaks from that water line, depending on where it's turned off. And two, there's still very likely manure in those houses as well. So if there is a leak and a release, and when birds are not there, this inspection still needs to happen. All right. Cool. If you have liquid manure, you need to know the depth of the manure so you know that you're not going to be overtopping. And we do have requirements on how close to the rim you can actually get. Wastewater operations and pumps. And then storage structures with these different items. And then we have this catch-all other. So one thing that could apply for this is the organic, and so the additional inspections that happen at organic operations. This could be something that falls into any other this catch-all requirement right here. Cool. Any questions on the different types of inspections? Typically, we get a question or two on this. Okay, don't be shy. All right. Cool. All right. So this is the inspections required for no lands. So if you are not utilizing the manure, litter, process water in the land application area that you control. So these are largely the same, except it doesn't have the land application stuff in there. So I'm going to breeze over these since we didn't have any questions with the more comprehensive list. All right. Cool. 9 minimum standards. So these are minimum standards which means that they're minimum and you can't do anything less than these. You can do more if you want. And there are some instances where you're required to do more. But these are the 9 minimum standards right here. So the first one is ensure adequate storage or capacity. I do want to note on this one, in the EPA's permit writer's manual, they talk about you need storage that can handle a 25-year, 24-hour storm event. And in there, it talks about you need at least 1 foot of freeboard. So that is the distance from where the liquid is to the top. And then you need, on top of that 1 foot, you need capacity for a 25-year, 24-hour storm event, which is a massive storm. It's not it's not a storm where you're getting 3 or 4 inches. It's more than that. Typically, it's around 6, 7, 8 inches of water. So it is a massive storm. And it varies depending on where you are in the state. So not only do you need that 1 foot of freeboard, in the event where there is not a 25-year, 24-hour storm event, you actually need more than a foot. You'll need that foot plus the 6 or 7 inches if you don't also have runoff that is going into that storage container. Any questions on that? All right. Proper management of mortalities. So your carbon to nitrogen ratio, how much browns, how much green waste you're using is very important from this. You don't want leachate coming from compost piles. Tends to not smell too well. You might get some calls from some neighbors. Those neighbors might call us when that happens. So make sure that you are staying on top of mortality management, especially if it's compost. And NDA has this really handy recipe guide for compost. So if you are an operator and you're wanting to learn more about that, NDA has some excellent material on that. All right, divert clean water. So a major tenet of the Clean Water Act is to keep clean water clean. So if it's diverting away from pollution sources, so maybe having a roof, if it does come in contact with a pollutant or something like that, then that stormwater is captured and not discharged. Preventing direct contact confined with animals and surface waters. That one should be pretty self-explanatory. Don't want to have animals in surface waters. I've heard the NDA folks that fences are free. So if you have animals in water, NDA can help you with that. And there shouldn't be any reason why there are animals in surface waters. Any questions on that? And we do have a few NDA folks on the line, if you have any further questions on that. Okay. Chemical handling would include stuff like pesticides, cleaning agents, fuels. Would also include like fertilizers as well. I should say commercial fertilizers. All right. Conservation practices to control nutrient loss. This is what I was talking about with, I forget the gentleman's name at the beginning, with the WIP goals, having various different conservation practices. There's more than just those that are required by the WIP. So you would have to have those in your plan as well if you're implementing them. And it's very site specific because not all practices can be applied in all situations. Those are very site specific. I should note on this one right here, this 100 feet with the 35-foot vegetated filter strip. If you are building new houses, this 35 feet does not apply. We have new source standards, and 100 feet it defaults back to 100 feet in all situations for new sources. Any questions on that? We just had this come up either yesterday or today, actually. Okay. All right, moving on. Talking about temporary sealed storage. So here it's important. You may dry stockpile for less than 14 days is your time limit for dry temporary field storage of dry poultry manure. We have the second provision right here. If you're going to store greater than 14 days, then you need to follow an NRCS practice standard. If I'm remembering my practice standard, you have 180 days for this. And then MDA, you can stack for, I believe it is a year. The nutrient management folks can correct me, but that is not what our permit says. And if you're subject to our permit, it'd either be 14 days. If you need to stack longer than 14 days, you need to be following that NRCS practice standard. Any questions on that? All right, now we're getting into MAFOs, stacking for that. And again, since this isn't a discharge to surface water, there's some slightly different timeframes for the Maryland animal feeding operations. Okay. Then we have protocols for soil testing. Note that we are referencing MDA's regulations right here. Okay. Protocols for land application of manure and wastewater. Here we talk about the various different setback requirements, alternative setbacks under certain conditions that have to do with whether or not you have vegetative filter strip or not. There's some other criteria in here as well for that. Any questions on setbacks for land application? All right. And then record keeping. It's very important. If you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. From an
Sorry,
inspection.
I just submitted a question on the last item.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. I was on a roll. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Nope, no problem, no problem. It's a long
All
night.
right. So would you consider supporting a greater setback from water from communities as well? So that's why we are having these different listening sessions, and so that we can get that input as well. So just make sure that we're going to consider all of these. Again, we can't be less stringent than the EPA and what law requires, We can also be more stringent. And those are some things that we would consider, but we also have to consider comments from other stakeholders as well. All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. We have additional requirements for land applying process wastewater. So again, this is process wastewater. It tends to not stay in one place. So there's going to be some more requirements for this. So now we're getting into like hydraulic loading and slopes and all that fun stuff. All right. Okay, here we have other best management practices where we are talking about odors. We're talking about outdoor air quality if it's determined to be a resource concern. And then we're also talking about organic poultry operation. Now, again, we have posted criteria for organic poultry operations on our website. I think that's been posted since May. And that we are going to be getting our first plan. I was told the first plan is already done, but hopefully we'll be able to post those for public comment pretty soon. Any questions on other best management practices? Looks like Marcia left the meeting. All right. Okay, new or modified operations. So lagoon bottoms and embankments. Dependent new source criteria performance standards for swine, poultry, veal. And then we have new source performance design criteria specific to new source for poultry operations. These are additional, more robust requirements. This is where the 100-foot requirement that I talked about before, where the 35 with vegetative filter strip does not apply. We have a document that is on our website, which talks about the new source performance design criteria. Any questions on that? Comments? Cool. Okay. Documentation of changes of permitted operations. So these first ones are the large changes of ownership, animals, MAFO, CAFOs, changes from no land to land or vice versa. Documentation for permanent modifications. What do we need to know? We have documentation for unanticipated changes right here. That could be changes in herd or flock size. Could be an example. Anticipated changes. Changing from a CAFO to a MAFO, which oftentimes, or I shouldn't say often, sometimes that happens. pretty rare. So. Emergency or catastrophic losses. So sometimes you'll hear about avian influenza. We work very closely with our friends at MDA whenever a situation like that happens, because they do have requirements about how do you quarantine and how do you make sure that you're not spreading that further than it already has. Okay. Looks like Marsha's back with us. All right, part 5. So this is the last section of the permit that we'll be reviewing. So monitoring. All right. Any questions on monitoring before we go to the annual report? Okay.
How do you verify that the sampling and analytic methods comply? I'm sorry, you went back
Oh.
down. Keep going down a little bit.
Oh, for
What is
these
the
ones right here?
verification? What is the verification process for verifying that the sampling and analytical methods used do conform to these procedures?
So if a sample is taken, we would want this information to come along with the permit. So we are, this is a self-reporting permit. We have the ability to take our own samples, and we have in the past. We did want, we just recently did that at an operation. But if you're going to be taking a sample, this is important information to have with that. If you don't have that information, it starts to lose some of its credibility as far as a sample. So this is an MDA has requirements for sampling as well. There are guidelines for test procedures in the CFRs, the Code of Federal Regulations. So this is the EPA stuff right here. So
Yep. I guess the basis of my question is really at what level are you able to sort of sample verify? Like I know all government agencies are stretched, underfunded, and overtasked, and they keep adding more tasks. Is there a percentage rate at which you sort of test sample,
so
randomly sample the compliance?
So for us, we're doing those on a complaint basis right now. As you say, we are stretched pretty thin, although we have added 3 new inspectors. Some of that is backfilling inspectors. One of them is a brand new position that came along with some legislation that was recently passed. Not recently, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It was passed. So that's how we are currently handling it if we're going to be taking sampling. Our water group goes out and samples waterways all the time as well, and if so, they have a lot more. They're doing that a lot more than we are.
Great, thank you.
Yep. I should say, when I say we, this particular unit in the Maryland Department of Environment. Okay. All right, annual reporting. Annual reports are due March 1st. That's a very important date right there. So, typically these go, there was some efforts a few years ago to coordinate this with in the reporting that the Maryland Department of Agriculture was already doing, because there a lot of the information was actually the same. So most of these reports will actually go to NDA first, and then we get them after that. So the total maximum number of animals kept, manure that was litter, process, wastewater that was generated, amount of animal waste that is land applied, the amount of waste that is transported off-site, any liquid impoundments, acres used, summary of manure. I should say one. So for this land application stuff, oftentimes we have uh, we have uh, op, we'll say farmers. Oh, I don't want to pay $19. Farmers that will send their manure off to another crop farmer, which you're allowed to do. In the CFRs, the EPA's regulations, it is the responsibility of the CAFO, not the responsibility of the manure broker or the person receiving that waste to take that manure, litter, process, wastewater sample. Is the responsibility in law with the EPA to take that sample. So, if you're signing this permit and you're certifying that you're going to comply with that, you are also certifying that you are going to take that manure sample. All right. Cool. And Adobe really wants me to upgrade.
Do it, do it.
I don't know. I don't even know if I have $19. I just had pens that were denied. So if anybody has some pens, that'd be great. All right. Any signatures on reports or questions on this? We already talked a little bit about this, but
You mentioned above that a different department gets the reports and then they come to you. Do you also get any flags from that department?
So we do have information. A lot of what we do are regulated the same. I would have to point to my goes my staff who's in charge of that. Like if we're getting flagged on that information, but we do, and we report this to I believe it's the EPA as well, how often we're doing reviews of those reports. So it's not just we're taking it and filing it. We are doing reviews on those, and those are reviewed by our inspectors as well as a part of the inspection. So we are verifying whatever the plan says, does it match what the report says? Are you over-applying manure? If you are, then that's not good because your plan only says that you can apply this much. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. You have to keep your reports on site. Oh man. I'm sorry, Adobe. Then we have a non-compliance notification. And what some of those items might be. This is pretty egregious. That's not even let me exit out of it. Oh boy. Let's reload this. which I thought I had Adobe Pro on here. So I don't know what's going on with that. Okay. So this is notifications to the department. If they're, and these are self-reported issues. This is a duty of care provision right here. Things that need to be done if there's an upset. Which is the last part that we're going to talk about in this permit. Because again, this is talking about violations of the permit conditions. The next part is talking about our general provisions, which we don't have a lot of wiggle room on those. And then the last part is our authority, which we have the authority to regulate CAFOs in the state of Maryland. All right. Cool. Now we're going to open it up. If there wasn't something that you had saw in this particular in the permit, because again, we started with the current permit because we're going to be building off of that. So we wanted to make sure that we it was a good place to start. But if you didn't necessarily see something and you wanted to, that was in there that you wanted to make a comment on, then we can certainly take any comments, feedbacks, questions from you all. All righty.
I'll just jump in and
go
say
ahead.
I'm in Montgomery County, and so I'm not directly implicated, but I appreciate the many pauses you've taken to let people think about if they want to ask questions. And I just want to say that's great, and that's the process. That's the way the process should look going forward. It feels like sometimes that hasn't been just the pattern in terms of timing. So thank you.
Yeah. It's been a journey, definitely. So, and again, as I said at the beginning, we want to make sure that we are receiving input from a diverse set of stakeholders. So I had that slide. There's a lot of different folks that where this, if they're not subject to the permit, like the farmers, like they have a stake in this, and we want to hear from those folks. So thank you for all the questions that you provided. Gabby.
Thanks. I'm probably going to be submitting written comments because I have quite a few. And obviously I want to be, aware of everyone's time this evening. But I do want to make a note of the inadequacies of public notice for this process. Specifically, the press release from MDE was published less than 2 weeks before the in-person hearings on the shore. It was published, specifically on 9/12, and the first listening session was in Princess Anne on 9/23. And, I know for a fact that several people in which that I communicate and work with, the press release did not include any of the online virtual information. And it was made public literally yesterday. And I just want to say that, like, if we're going to do this process, and I do appreciate your time this evening, and I appreciate, the efforts of the other employees that are on tonight, but we need to do better as far as getting the information and, press releases out there so that people have an adequate time to prepare and obviously make the necessary plans to be able to participate, because I feel like a lot of the issues on the Eastern Shore is that, a lot of people work 9 to 5s. A lot of people work different jobs. People have children, a lot of different things going on. And they look to people like me to provide them with, information. And, less than 2 weeks notice is sometimes very difficult for us to be able to pull information and get the word out to people because, people aren't actively looking at the MDE website. They're not actively, always on Facebook. So, we also try, the organization, myself and the organization, other organizations on here, try to make sure that we're giving adequate notice as well. So, more specifically, like the vulnerable communities that are impacted by CAFOs, I'm going to speak on just the shore because those are the people that I work with. My organization's been around for years, and we do work directly with this. So we're just trying to bring awareness of the fact that it felt like a little bit of a last ditch effort. Not obviously blaming you, but this is something that we definitely need to do better on as far as, incorporating reasonable amount of notice.
Yeah, well, thank you for that feedback. As I said before, we're going to be doing this a lot more. Definitely some lessons learned. We wanted to make sure that we had multiple opportunities for folks to join in. So yeah, definitely subscribe. If you are not subscribed to our Insta, is that what we're calling it these days? YouTube, Facebook, X, formerly known as Twitter. That you're going to get a lot of really great information, and we're planning on doing this a lot more. So that's going to be a great resource for anyone and everyone out there. And I'm sure everyone, as I was talking, already did that. So thank you for that. But yeah, it's we definitely need to get adequate notice for folks when we're going to be doing these. All right. Any other questions or comments? I'm going to look at the chat.
Gabby, you made very good comments. Do you work in communications for CCIC?
I am the founder of CCIC, but I have a background in just I guess just working on this for many years. I do work in marketing, so I guess I have a little bit of more of a communications background than most, but yeah.
And it's called the Innovation Campus, right? Is that the correct CCIC?
It's actually Concerned Citizens Against Industrial CAFOs, CCAIC.
Okay, CCAIC. Thank you, ma'am.
Yep.
I have what may seem like a technical or even annoying question, but it looks like MDE is calling them AFOs, but the rest of the world calls them CAFOs, and there seems to be a different message in one versus the other.
Yes. So going back to this, not all AFOs are regulated. AFOs, stable or confined, and are fed or maintained for 45 days. If you're large enough, then you're a CAFO. Or if we can demonstrate that you have a discharge, then we can designate you from an AFO to a CAFO, and you would have to be permitted. And it's very similar thinking for medium MAFOs, which other states don't have MAFOs. Those are Maryland animal feeding operations. Because we do regulate, want to make sure that we're regulating discharges to groundwater also.
Thanks.
So that's the nuance with that. And sometimes people use them interchangeably too, as well. So you are right. Yeah, it can be a little bit confusing on that. All right. Jennifer.
Sure, thanks. Jennifer Kunze here. I'm with an environmental organization called Clean Water Action. And I just wanted to first echo Gabby's comments about public notice. I think, learning curves and all, but making sure that, for example, even the press release for this series of listening sessions had been linked on the AFO landing page for people to see, which I don't think it was, as well as making sure the Google Meets link was up on the press release just the same way as the addresses of the in-person listening sessions would have gone a long way to making sure that people who wanted to participate were able to participate. As well as making sure that the website reflects the fact that people can email comments to you. I think that wouldn't be clear to anybody who didn't listen to you say it just now. So making sure that that information is up on the website as well would be really helpful. But on the substance of the thing, I just wanted to lift up that the permit should incorporate really stronger protections against inundation and sea level rise. Obviously a lot of the Eastern Shore is very low lying, and it's really important to keep new CAFO permits, or AFO permits, not just CAFOs, out of flood prone areas, and not to only rely on old data. We see very often regulatory processes referring to old 100-year floodplains, but as we've seen across the country in the past month or two, the old data is not really reliable in terms of climate change, and especially on the shore with sea level rise. And so making sure that the process keeps CAFOs out of flood prone areas, not only places that have been flood prone in the past, but places that are going to be flood prone in the future, is going to be really important to protecting the waterways and protecting people's drinking water. And then finally, I know this will be the focus of a lot of attention, but making sure that the permit doesn't overlook air pollution from animal feeding operations, for example, ammonia and the health impacts that has on people. It's going to be really important in terms of requiring scrubbers, for example, increasing setbacks, especially for the larger types of feeding operations, are all going to be really necessary for protecting public health. So those are my points.
Yeah, and thank you for those. Just an item on the 25-year report related to what you said about flood prone areas, but not exactly with the like 100-year flood areas, but NRCS and our Water and Science Administration, I believe, are currently reviewing like what is a 25-year, 24-hour storm. So that information is getting updated, and then storage requirements would have to be adjusted accordingly after that. So that is a process. There's a lot of data to look at. They're working on, but that is something that is being worked on, because we are seeing stronger, more intense, more frequent storms. So the calculations that were relied on in the past might not be as relevant.
Interesting. Thanks.
Yeah. Diana, you had a comment.
Yeah, thank you again. So that tags right onto my question, which was, what is the process for and the timing for recalculating all that? I know you probably have to wait on somebody else to do it, but I really just want to know, like, how seriously is this being taken, and can you guys press the folks who are doing the numbers and just say you're getting squeezed from the annoying civic activists out here across the state who want to say those numbers are useless, get on with it?
So that was I know it's being worked on. That was a conversation with NRCS, someone there. It's being updated, but I'm not quite sure what the time frame is on that. But I can try, if you send me an email, I can try and track that down for you.
That would be great. And it's just really that in the meantime, permits are going out the door, right?
Correct. Yes. Permits are going up.
With the old numbers, the old standards, the old thresholds for storms and expectations.
Toby. Toby, you may be muted.
Look at that. I started talking and I was still on mute. Apologies there. And thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss tonight. My name is Toby Harris with the South Baltimore Community Land Trust here in Baltimore City proper, and wanting to agree and echo the sentiments that have been shared around, needing a little bit more in touch outreach so that community can be aware of this event and know that they're able to participate. And then those exact sentiments that were shared about updating and getting the updated new information, understanding that we're basing decisions off of outdated and inefficient data sets at this point, and really wanting to echo what Jennifer was sharing about the need for permits around air pollution, just understanding from a public health perspective the direct impacts of folks, our neighbors in the Eastern Shore and all across the region. When you look at air toxins like VOCs, volatile organic carbons, ammonia, dust, dander, nitrous oxide, amongst other, that can spread several miles from these facilities. So you have that air pollution, and then these chemicals are eventually settling in the water. So you have water pollution as well, and just really wanting to be sensitive to the human and environmental impacts, and wanting to make sure that these permits are taken into consideration and kind of adequately addressed. So really, again, just appreciate the chance to give feedback tonight, but wanting to make sure going forward we're really able to truly engage, with all impacted folks, and making this, opportunity really accessible. But thank you again, and those are essentially my comments for the evening.
Yeah, and thank you for those. And again, we are going to have an official public comment period for the permit, where we would respond to each comment that is submitted to us. So there's going to be more opportunity. You can always send me an email as well, and we can go from there. All righty. Any other questions, comments, clarifications out there? Oh, is there new? Oh, I see. Okay, it's just the echoing concerns. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Looks like we're going to get out a little bit early, which is great. And there's going to be more opportunities to provide comments. Feel free to send me an email. We have some folks from NBA here as well. So if you want to have questions about some of the things that they're doing, I'm sure they'd be happy to help. And then, looking forward to dropping this permit early next year.